You're listening to the Ecocide Report, a monthly podcast from Stop Ecocide International and the Movement for Ecocide Law. Stop Ecocide International is working tirelessly to get ecocide recognised by the International Criminal Court, but we need your help. If you value this content or want to support the work of Stop Ecocide International, you can become a patron over at patreon.com for just 1 hour's wage per month. Your support makes our work possible, and we can't thank you enough.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 8 of the Ecocide Report. I'm here with Jojo Mather. Did you want to go through our agenda for today?
Yeah, so we're in an unusual setting today. We're actually at the Watershed in Bristol, and there's been an event here today coordinated by the University of West of England, which has been a discussion of a whole number of different stakeholders around ecocide law and developments, particularly in the UK, but of course it has touched on many broader themes, and we'll be touching on a number of those in this episode. Excellent.
There's been so much that's happened, obviously, in the interregnum. We've had COP28, you've been doing work with the ECD, you've also met with the European Council. Do you want to talk about any of those and the order that you choose?
Well, okay, so I mean, I suppose if I'm thinking sort of back in date order since we last met, we've had the political agreement, the all-important political agreement at the European Union, so between the Parliament, the Council and the Commission, which basically sets in motion the revision of the Environmental Crimes Directive for Europe. And that has been a massive milestone in terms of the momentum towards ecocide law, because in that revised directive there is now going to be the inclusion of what they have called a qualified offence, which basically is saying that, you know, any one of a broad list of crimes, which has also been expanded in that environmental crimes in that directive, if any of those is committed to the extent that it creates severe and long-lasting or irreversible damage, which obviously is very much ecocide language, then it will have more severe penalties, and there'll be, you know, sort of corresponding seriousness, weight and sentencing associated with that. And although the word ecocide wasn't used in the operative text, in the descriptive commentary, what's called the recital that goes with it, it was clearly stated that this would cover cases comparable to ecocide. And so when we look at how fast that means this whole initiative has been moving, it's quite extraordinary, because we think about 4 or 5 years ago, no governments were talking about ecocide, you know, and then November 2023, the EU makes political agreement to actually legislate for something very close to that. So we're talking, for international law, that's kind of rocket speed. And so it's very encouraging to see those developments. And that has also kind of pushed the conversation at the international level kind of up a notch. So, I mean, we can talk about COP shortly as well, but right after COP28, a couple of us went out to the UN in New York, where the Assembly of States Parties for the International Criminal Court was taking place. And it was quite clear from conversations there that, you know, that whole shift with the European milestone, if you like, has really moved the conversation in a subtle but profound way from, you know, if this is going to happen, to how it is likely to happen. And that is really quite, you know, an important development. And it's really kind of, again, it's moved everything kind of up yet another gear.
That's excellent. We also heard a little bit about, if you like, some domestic ecocide action here in the UK, the Scottish ecocide bill.
Absolutely. So MSP Monica Lennon has been championing an ecocide bill for Scotland that is currently still going through, at the time of recording, it is still going through its consultation process. So if we get this episode out on time, you may even still have time to go and contribute to the Scottish consultation at ecocidelaw.scot, I believe it is. And we had Monica Lennon with us today, explaining the journey of how that's been to move that forward, and that conversation at the regional level in Scotland. And it's very important that these moves are supported and advocated for at all levels. You know, it's the local level, it's the regional level, it's the international level. contrary to what we might have expected a few years ago, what we're finding is that particularly since the emergence of the independent expert panel's definition in 2021, we're seeing a coherence across these different levels, across different jurisdictions, where some of the some of the phrasing, some of the principles, and sometimes wholesale that definition, have been inspiring these developments, and that's very much the case potentially in Scotland. So it's really exciting to see that development, and we know that the consultations already had a decent number of responses, but it would be really exciting to have more people join that, and for it to be made clear that this is important. And I think Scotland is interesting, particularly as well, because Scotland will also be looking to the EU in terms of harmonising what they're doing there as well. So it's really exciting times. I mean, with the EU development, we're talking about 27 states that are all going to have to move somewhat in this direction. There'll have to be a minimum. At minimum, they'll have to harmonise with what's been said at the EU level, and actually, there may be states that will actually, take that additional step and sort of into that kind of territory of a general offence of anything that creates this level of harm. And actually, excitingly, Belgium is about to do that this coming week, in the sense that their penal code has been revised to include ecocide, and that is effectively is going to be formalised this coming week in early February. So all very exciting.
That's an amazing result. The idea of having a Belgian domestic ecocide law in a couple of weeks is, wow, it's a game changer. But something similar, not exaggerated, but something similar is going on in the UK, in England as well, because Baroness Boycott has a private member's bill.
That's right, that's right. So Baroness Boycott from the House of Lords, a crossbench Lord, she has put forward a private member's bill on ecocide specifically, again, closely aligned with the proposed international definition. Now, we don't know, because of the fact that, as everybody's talking about, this is a massive election year around the world, also in the UK, and the time span that we have before that election may mean that it's unlikely that the bill will, come to fruition, in its full sense, but it may reach a second reading. And what is important about that is that it is raising awareness, it is educating, it is educating Westminster, and that is really important, because what we're seeing at a global level is that there is an already established direction of travel, and sooner or later, all states are going to have to start considering this. So a private member's bill like this is a brilliant way of bringing the conversation into the House of Lords and having it more broadly discussed. And that's going to be significant in terms of the conversation in this country.
Last year, we had the largest COP in its history, over 100,000 attendees. And Dubai was incredibly eventful and very full and packed. Did you want to talk in a bit more detail about what Stop Ecocide International did?
Yeah, we took a sizable team to attend COP28, and that was interesting in itself. There were some organisations that boycotted COP28 because of it being in Dubai and the president of the COP essentially having connections with the oil industry. Completely understandable, but at the same time, I mean, for us, we felt that it was absolutely, fundamentally important that this issue of ecocide law is brought into the conversations at these enormous conferences. And of course it is also, these big UN conferences are exceptional opportunities to access policymakers and influencers, as well as key NGOs and other players. And so it's incredibly important when one is building a global conversation particularly around a very specific issue, which is what we're doing. We felt that it was actually very important that we were there. And we had quite a varied team, including yourself. It was brilliant to have you with us. And we had a number of Youth for Ecocide Law, which is our big and growing, very fast-growing global youth network with us, who did an incredible job of bringing the ecocide law conversation into many different events and contexts around the conference. We also had an official side event, joint with the Republic of Vanuatu, which is who we often partner with, a country that never ceases to amaze me in how much it really punches above its weight in the diplomatic sphere and just doing incredible work. And we shared that stage with also the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as the campaign for a moratorium on Arctic development in the Arctic, extractive development in the Arctic. So kind of various legal, if you like, avenues. And it felt like, and actually we ended up kind of describing it as sort of the reality check panel, in the sense that, there's a certain, there's so much discussion and sort of wrangling over wording and all of this that goes on at the level of the negotiation, the climate negotiations. And I think, it becomes so easy to just focus on carbon. It becomes so easy to, focus on sort of nuances of wording when we have a situation where the key vital ecosystems of the planet are constantly being damaged and destroyed, and actually making that connection between ecosystem destruction and climate is a really important thing to do, and to actually say, well, look, actually, this is what's happening, and what's needed is something muscular, something legal. And so in that way, that panel felt like, connecting that sort of incredibly wordy conversation and all of that wrangling, if you like, with something that actually anchors to the physicality of what is happening on the planet. And that felt to me to be a really important aspect of what we were doing there at COP28. And the other thing that emerged during COP28 was a report from a group based in the University of Exeter, which was talking about tipping points, which was reminding us how many key points we're potentially, about to cross in terms of damage to climate and environment. But what was also interesting about that report is that it also listed, and as far as I'm aware, this is a first, it also listed not just 5 very scary tipping points, but 5 positive tipping points in terms of things that could actually start to shift that vicious cycle and towards a virtuous one. And guess what? Ecocide-level was amongst those 5 tipping points. And I think that's really telling because, having, this kind of intervention that kind of inserts itself into the fabric of the system, but really has that potential to create a new framing and a level of deterrence and like I say, a kind of a connection, a direct anchoring in what's happening in reality to the physical planet. So that was also a really encouraging thing to have that report come out.
That's excellent. I mean, one of the really strong features, there were less strong features. One of the stronger features of the UAE declaration was for the fact that the first time ever in the carbon COP process, the biodiversity target from COP 15 was brought in, the 30 by 30 goal, hence emphasizing the fact that Stop Ecocide International's work protecting local and global ecosystems is now pivotal, even in the carbon COP process. Could you talk in a bit more detail about ASP?
Yeah, the ASP, so that's the Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So for us, as an advocacy organisation around ecocide law, it's absolutely our sort of main event every year, if you like. And it's where all the states that are signatories to the Rome Statute meet up, usually in The Hague. In 2023, in December, it was actually in New York, which happens every few years when they're electing judges. And we have a presence there. We've had a presence at that assembly for the last few years. It was, of course, in the 2019 assembly that Vanuatu put to the rest of the members of that assembly that they should consider the addition of ecocide into the Rome Statute. And since then, we've been collaboratively with those most climate vulnerable states like Vanuatu, Samoa, Bangladesh, running side events in the margins of that assembly, building that conversation year on year. And there were actually 2 events this year focusing around ecocide. So we did one in collaboration with the permanent missions to the United Nations of Vanuatu and Samoa. And there was another one that was backed by Ukraine, Estonia, and Romania. So the topic was very much front and center in the program. And we also, as we always do at these events, we held also closed-door meetings, inviting state members, ambassadors, legal advisors, and so forth. And we could see, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, but we can see that the developments in Europe and also the fact that a number of national jurisdictions have also had ecocide law proposals put in the last sort of 6 months had really started to shift that conversation. And, we continue to, offer advice and assistance and convening support around growing that conversation within that context. And we certainly expect to see that to sort of move to another level of seriousness this year. So that's also been a very important shift.
Hello everyone, I'm here with Natalie Bennett. We've just attended a Stop Ecocide International event here at Bristol. We're going to be exploring her thoughts about the day that we've had. Natalie, how are you finding it?
Well, it's been a really constructive day, and it's great to look at both the different nations of the UK-wide and the international perspective together, because we have a planet that's absolutely on the edge. We've exceeded, the Stockholm Institute says, 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries they've identified. And we've got to look at this holistically and say we have to protect the ecosystems that we are as a human animals part of, we live within, we utterly rely on.
Excellent. So ecocide is definitely a core part of resolving our climate ecological emergency. Talk to me in a bit more detail about the salient points you came out with today. What were the top 3 things you heard today that made you think, I want to work on this particular aspect of the topic and take it forward?
Well, I think what we heard today was we've started the debate, and we're hearing the Scottish Parliament is consulting on a law there in Scotland. I was a couple of years ago able to get the first debate in the British Parliament of the new definition of ecocide. So the first thing is we've got this on the agenda. We're starting there. We have a number of nation states that are championing it. The next step is, where do we go now? And what's really crucial is that we actually keep the momentum going, keep it going forward. We heard talk today that it might be within a year's time we might be actually seeing this debated at the ICCC. So we've got to that point. But then I think the third thing we've also got to think about is, how does this fit together with a whole lot of other initiatives that are happening, initiatives like the duty to prevent law, which is coming in some degree in the EU, that's happening in the UK as well. How does this fit with future generations, bills and acts? So we've got to look at how of this is all an ecosystem, if you like, of law. How does all this work on a technical and practical kind of level?
Excellent. So if you were talking to an audience of people who didn't know very much about Stop Ecocide law, not just its implementation either in domestic or international jurisdictional focus, where would you say would be a good place to start looking at it in terms of examining definitions, or thinking about the implications for their ordinary everyday lives, or even thinking about the broader international context in which that's being discussed? What sort of story would you ask people to tell themselves or explore?
Well, I think it's really useful to think of this in terms of pictures, and we had some wonderful art that I think will be incorporated in this program, recording what we did today. But if you think about what does ecocide mean, I think we can imagine 2 pictures. One, a beautifully thriving mangrove forest, for example, and then a decimated desert of dead soil. And that sums up what is ecocide. And if we paint that picture to people, we were talking about how groups of the Children's Parliament in Scotland has looked at this issue. I think most people will instinctively get that that's something we cannot allow to happen. And I think the other important thing to get across is we're not talking here about individual behaviour. We're talking about system change. We're talking about giant corporations that produce products that people have no choice but to buy and use. And those corporations putting the externalised costs, exposing us all to that pollution, to an unhealthy world, to damaging our health. So we have to think that we're talking here about something that's systemic, not something that's focused at all on individual behaviour.
That's excellent. I think looking at systemic issues, both domestically and internationally, are there certain precursors for wider change that you've seen? Are there new developments that have happened in the recent past that give you hope for the future?
Well, I think where we are now is people realise that where we are now is profoundly unstable. It's not going to continue as it is now. And when I first got involved in politics, people would say, oh, we've had this financial shock, or we've had this environmental event, but we'll go back to normal soon. I think there's a general understanding that we are now in the age of shocks. There is no normal, there is no sustainability in what we have now. And so there is a real genuine understanding of the need to change. little advert, I've got a book coming out soon called Change Everything, and we need to change everything. And what's behind that is an understanding that we have now a cost of living crisis. We have now, particularly in Britain, a public health crisis. We have all of these crises, and they're caused by the failure to transition to a sustainable economy, a sustainable world. So it's not a case of saying, oh, we can't afford to do this now because it's too expensive. We can't afford not to do this, and the messes we're in now are because we haven't done it previously.
We've just spent a day going through elements of Stop Ecocide law, focusing on where the UK is now and how progressive progress can be made in that legislation. What did you find most interesting about the day?
Well, I mean, I've been working on ecocide issues for an awful long time, and sometimes we were much engaged with the past ecocide discussions at the UN level, etc. So it's really nice now to start getting down into sort of concrete discussions about what it would mean to have domestic legislation, etc. You know, for many years I've been looking at the international arena where, you know, there was what we would call, you know, a massive hole in international law. Where you have, you know, an individual can be prosecuted for, you know, committing genocide, but not massive environmental destruction. You know, so it's always been something I've been very, very interested in, and it's you know, especially when we have now a global ecological crisis, the importance of having an international crime of ecocide has always been something that I've been very, very concerned about. But it's really nice now to see discussions as well to go in tandem with the international level. Discussions about what it would look like in a domestic, you know, national context. So yeah, it's getting down to the nitty-gritty and trying to pin down exactly what it would look like in a domestic context. So that's the most interesting thing for me.
You're right. I think that the gap in the Treaty of Rome that allowed ecocide to go unpunished separately was a gaping gap. And in terms of implementing that in UK law, the process is important. But I also want to talk to you about the destination. So in terms of implementing ecocide law in UK domestic law, are there any priorities you'd like the audience to think about that haven't been sort of in the public domain that much, but came up today or are part of your, you know, your academic expertise? Just themes that you want to raise.
Well, I think, you know, we're all becoming increasingly aware of how degraded our environment is becoming. And I think, you know, if we'd been in a position where we had the prospect of criminal, you know, sanctions for the kinds of things that we're now suffering. Like, you know, we've heard a lot about the state of our rivers, you know, sewage pollution and things like that. Obviously, we'd be a lot better off without them. And I think, you know, thinking about the things that we don't like about the present and how a law of ecocide would possibly stop that happening is one really, really important way, I think, of thinking what it could look like in the future with such legislation. Because you know, it's only going to get more important. And I think, you know, the domestic prospects for, you know, legislation which will help us in this terrible, terrible situation we find ourselves in is absolutely vital. And I think that one way of imagining what it could look like is to think about all the things that we don't like currently. And, you know, obviously not all of those will be covered by something like ecocide, which has quite a high threshold, but at least it allows us to think about the worst excesses and those being potentially, you know, criminalised.
Excellent. So in terms of a practical and or just transition, there are elements of the way that ecocide law is both drafted and implemented that probably should be amplified in the public domain. We should be talking broadly about the impact that ecocide law has on people within protected characteristics under the law, but there are probably other characteristics as well, like class, for example, which aren't protected in the law, but I think are pivotal to achieving a just transition. Were there elements of your work or anything you saw today that sort of helped you think about that transition, that pathway?
Well, I think it's very, very important as well to realise that, you know, the people most responsible for the kinds of environmental destruction that we're concerned with when we talk about ecocide are not the average person who's just going about their normal lives with their normal work, etc. It's people who have, the kind of superior responsibility for the kinds of decisions that result in large-scale environmental damage. So it's very, very important, I think, to realise that it's not the average person who'd be captured by these kind of, new offences. So that's definitely a class dimension. I think it's very, very important to make sure that people understand that those kind of normal behaviours will not be captured by this. So yeah, and also, but it's also the question that a lot of the repercussions of environmental destruction are felt most acutely by those least responsible for it and most vulnerable. And I think another really, really important aspect which needs to be understood is that normal people aren't to blame for this kind of stuff.
You're right, absolutely. It's about system change rather than just atomized individual action. A very interesting comment came up in one of the conferences recently at Davos, actually, where the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, talked about direct and indirect subsidies that global fossil fuel companies receive, and talked about repurposing those. In terms of your work, you don't have to have followed what she said, verbatim, but in terms of your work, those sorts of ideas about repurposing subsidies and how they sit alongside the development of a practical polluter pays principle, are those themes that you want to develop in your work, and how do you think those sorts of things are relevant to the audience of this program?
Well, I think I've generally been more concerned with incentivizing good behavior. Right, so things like we see with the fossil fuel industry having tax breaks and things like that. I think that all needs to be channeled into much more environmentally friendly energy production, etc., renewables and things like that. So that's where I would think government intervention would help, and take away those kind of incentives from the most polluting activities, most polluting companies, most polluting endeavours, and channel that kind of incentivization towards much more green and renewable projects. I mean, that's where I see the hand of government coming alongside criminalising the worst behaviours.
Hey, good afternoon, Monica. We've just been through this amazing conference on ecocide, and you, as an MSP, had the most spectacular perspectives, because it was so different, I think, from some of the other ones that we heard. How did you find it?
Well, the fact that we're even having this discussion today and bringing people together, to me, that's so positive, and that's really, really encouraging. It feels like there's a real opportunity to not just advance discussion around ecocide law, but to actually deliver legal change. And I think that will help achieve the system change that many of us want to see and believe is essential. So it's been informative. I feel like I've learned so much, especially from people who are working more in academia, from campaigners, different political perspectives as well. So it's been a real safe space just to have a collaborative discussion, but also at times quite challenging as well, because not everyone agrees on everything, and I think that's healthy, that's okay. So it was good to have a safe space to talk about the opportunity and the goal that we're working towards, but what are the barriers, what are the challenges, what are the risks? And as a Member of Parliament in Scotland who has a proposed bill at the moment, it's just helped me to reflect and to challenge myself about, how do I really make sure that I can get the best possible legislation. So today's been really good just to think about all the different angles and things that I hadn't really thought about as well.
That's excellent. I think that one of the themes that emerged when we spoke today was about the way that local action impacts national legislation. And you mentioned that the local authorities in Scotland had a slightly more cooperative partnership in the way that they interacted with national government. Could you talk in a bit more detail about that? Certainly maybe the advantages that you feel you've had in being able to coordinate between these two layers of government in Scotland.
Yeah, I think I was able to draw on my background working in local government as an officer. I used to be a planner many years ago, and I was also a local councillor in my community in Hamilton in South Lanarkshire, which is not far from Glasgow. And so I'm a big believer in local democracy and the important institution that is local government. Because sometimes we think about a hierarchy and you feel that, you know, parliaments and governments are much more important than what happens in local town halls and so on. But in Scotland, we certainly have an ethos where we're trying to work towards principles where there are different spheres of government and one isn't more important than the other. So we don't always get it right, and if you speak to individual councillors and council leaders and government ministers, there's always tension and there's always arguments. But coming back to principles, it is about how do we get cooperation, how do we get co-production, how do we make sure that the legislation and policy that is agreed on nationally can actually be delivered locally, because if you don't have that local buy-in and local infrastructure, you're not going to get those national outcomes you're looking for. So we don't always get it right, but these principles are there, and most recently articulated through the Verity House Agreement, which is a partnership between local government and central government. So when we take evidence on bills, on proposals for legislation in the Parliament, local government are a really, really important stakeholder in all of that and partner. So I know that if my bill progresses through Parliament, the relevant parliamentary committee will want to hear what's the local government view on this. So if local councils come to the table and say, we don't think this could work, we don't have the resources, we don't have the skills, this is not enforceable, then it's just not going to be successful. So that's why it's been really important to think about, well, is there a role here for a more grassroots sort of a bottom-up approach? And I think council motions have been discussed because we've seen examples in Camden, and there's some discussions in Scotland about how local government can really send a signal, I suppose, to national government, but to corporations as well, and to others, that this is something that local government cares about and has a view. So yeah, I think there's definitely a big role there for local government.
Could you talk to us about what inspired you to bring this bill as an MSP to Holyrood?
Well, I've been hugely inspired by the work of Stop Ecocide International, and back in 2021 I started to learn much more about SEI and about ecocide law, because I hadn't really heard about it before. I mean, I realised that there had been so much campaigning and advocacy led by Polly Higgins, led by Jojo Mehta and so many others. I felt quite guilty actually that I hadn't known about it and hadn't been doing more. So I had a lot of learning to do, and that was back at a time when COP26 was happening in Scotland, in Glasgow. So it felt like there was a real need to do something, and it's a great privilege to be a member of Parliament, and I felt that I had an opportunity and a platform to do something. And looking across the political landscape, both at a UK level but also in Scotland, there was a real deficit in terms of policy and political commitment on ecocide law. So it felt like it was something that we could look at in Scotland, and I've been really pleased with the cross-party interest. There's been a lot of support and a lot of enthusiasm. So I've now got this consultation that makes it a bit more real, and we're testing out positions and ideas, but just really inspired by the need for action, and to realise that we can have campaigns and movements, but you also need political action, and you need to have legislation. So the fact that we have a climate and nature emergency that just seems to be getting more serious by the day, we don't really have time to waste. And I feel like if I can do something, not just for my constituents here now, but for future generations, it's about how do we prevent ecocide, and I feel like there's something we can do.
I'm here with the Dr. Suwita Randhawa, a lecturer at the University of West of England, who has hosted a pretty spectacular conference on ecocide law. And I wanted to turn to you to find out what your motivation was. Why did you pull this conference together, and did you come close to achieving some of your goals?
Thank you, Chidi. I suppose the main impetus behind this was as an ecocide researcher and sort of getting stuck into the to the academic side of things, but also keeping an eye out on real world developments, noticing how it's quite a fast pace level of developments happening across the world, except for in the UK. And as a couple of months went by, I noticed that there were sort of pockets of developments happening, for example, in Scotland, in the House of Lords in the UK. And it seemed to me that there needed to be a bit of a bringing together of these different stakeholders who were in some way raising awareness and the conversation on ecocide in the UK. So I suppose as part of the research I'm doing, the other side of it was to, in a way, convene interested stakeholders, ranging from Stop Ecocide International, heads of political parties, interested academics, councillors, to think about more strategic action on how we could support the criminalisation of ecocide, not only within the UK, but also the international criminalisation of ecocide.
Excellent. So obviously we had a great panel, a very diverse group of stakeholders you pulled. Within the context of the output that came out today, are there snippets of the output that you can share that indicate contributions that helped you amplify the gap between domestic ecocide action and international progress, for example?
So I think on the whole, it's been a recognition of the interconnectedness of this project. It's one that you can't sort of see it in isolation. There's an interrelationship between the local, the national, and the global. And I think the workshop today really brought that to the fore, how action taken in these respective spheres will often have a bit of a spiraling effect.
Hey, good afternoon, Carla. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, well, I've got a few different hats. I'm co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, but I'm also a councillor and a parliamentary candidate right here where we are today in Bristol.
Excellent. So we've just been at a conference this afternoon discussing ecocide. What were your thoughts?
I thought it was really good. I was glad to be able to take part. And I thought what was particularly useful about this series of workshops is the huge breadth in expertise of the people taking part. There were people from local government, from devolved governments, and from national, and also lawyers, campaigners, experts of all kinds. And so there was, frankly, I was the least expert person in the room, I would say, on ecocide specifically, but I thought it was a really fruitful discussion about how can we get the campaign to make ecocide a law taken seriously at all levels of government and really move it forward.
Excellent. And one of the things you're well known for is being one of the leading figures in the UK to call for climate change emergencies at local authority level. And within the context of that, ecocide law does have local applications and local ways of being amplified. How do you envisage the ecocide conversation unfurling in Bristol?
Well, I think we had an interesting discussion in the workshop about what role local government might have, because obviously I've got experience in getting motions passed at a local level that have national and international ramifications, because I wrote the climate emergency declaration that ended up being the first in Europe. And that motion was deliberately written in a way that simultaneously gave the imperative for the local council to act now and not wait for national government to catch up, but also to lobby national government and to start creating this momentum. So I think that's the question, really. I don't know if I've got the perfect answer, but the discussion that we had today around, do we want to do something similar where we encourage councils to all pass motions on ecocide? It's a tricky question, because is it mostly something that's better done at an international level, or is it something where councils have a role? Clearly, the definition of ecocide is a pretty high bar for defining what ecocide is. So I think we don't want to create a situation where we're giving the impression that cutting down a few trees here and there while we want to resist that would qualify as ecocide. But I think there might still be a role for local councils in building the momentum towards it, and especially towards national governments adopting it.
I'm here with Nina Della Parker, And we've just been at this amazing conference here in Bristol talking about ecocide law. Nina, would you like to introduce yourself?
So I am a local Camden councillor. I represent South Hampstead Ward, and I'm also the Cabinet Advisor on increasing green spaces and biodiversity in Camden. I also work at LEADA in their International Environmental Law Department, but I'm here in my personal capacity, very passionate about getting ecocide as the 5th crime to the Rome Statute.
So it was a really interesting conference for a whole bunch of reasons, but especially I think because it was a really nice, diverse crowd of stakeholders. Everyone came at it from very different perspectives. Could you talk a bit more about your perspective for both of the hats that you wear and what you got out of the conference today?
So yeah, bottom-up approach. Being a local councillor in Camden, I thought that even though ecocide is on an international scale, again, locally we can create this ripple of change across the UK, hopefully. And I do think that everyone can make a difference, and I think we need to really empower people that they can do that. I think Camden Council, being the first council to recognise ecocide as a local authority, was a great thing. We had massive help from Philip Sands as well, and from Anna Wright, who's a councillor in Highgate.
Well, thank you for staying with us, everyone. We've obviously had a very wide palette of comments from a very wide range of stakeholders, but I wanted to give you a chance, though, Jojo, to add any other business, if you like.
I suppose there's one development that we haven't mentioned, or only very briefly, and that is at the Council of Europe. Not to be confused with the EU, the Council of Europe is the body responsible for the European Court on Human Rights, and upholds the rule of law, democratic values, and so on in a wide range of states, 46 states, and is based in Strasbourg. And I was actually there last week as I was invited to contribute to a meeting of the Social and Health Committee, also with input from the group that is drafting a convention on environmental crime for the Council of Europe. And that's a convention on protection of the environment through criminal law. And I was invited to contribute on ecocide law and, of course, the developments in Europe and how that might potentially influence the draft convention. What's interesting is to think about how the EU has moved towards ecocide law. They've described a sort of broad list of acts, if you like. What, of course, we aim for ultimately at the international level, and this is what I was conveying also at the Council of Europe, is that ultimately it's most potent to move towards, if you like, a general offence, a standalone crime, something that says beyond this level of harm, no matter what it is you're doing, beyond this level of environmental harm, it becomes unacceptable and it becomes criminal. And that comes back to that sort of reality check thing, that effectively what you want to do is move those risk managers and legal counsels in the big corporations away from thinking, how do we somehow categorize what we're doing so it doesn't fit into this law? And away from that and more towards, what are we doing on the ground, and is it likely to trigger this this threshold? Exactly. And that, of course, is a fundamental shift in attitude. And as with criminal law generally, what we are aiming for here is changing behavior. And if you want to encourage behavior change, which of course is what criminal law is ultimately about, then that is the attitude that it's really important to encourage with legislative developments.
You've been listening to the Ecocide Report. You can find out more about all of the issues discussed in this episode via the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.